welcome. These lights are really bright. So there's three of us on this session, Article 6 Rulebook, Next Steps and Future Expectations. I drew the short straw of moderating this. I'm Guy Turner, founder, CEO of Trove Research. On my left is Lisa DeMarco, senior partner and CEO of Resilient LLP, deep experience in international climate law. I'm just summarizing. And David Antonioli, CEO of Verra, again, a seasoned expert in a lot of these issues. I said I would start off by giving a dummy's guide to Article 6, not being a lawyer myself, just being sort of an interested participant and observer of this sector. But before I do that, could I just have a show of hands? Who has heard of Article 6.2? And who has heard of Article 6.4? Who understands Article 6.2 and 6.4? Okay. We've got a bit of education to do, I think ourselves as well. So I will just give a lay sort of interpretation of it. And I'm not trained as a lawyer, I'm trained as an economist. So I take things fairly simplistically and look at the bigger picture. And there's a lot of concern about what Article 6 would, where it would come out and what it would mean when in Glasgow. And when I read through the drafts and the final version, nothing really surprised me. To me, it was clarification of a lot of basic principles that had been talked about and seemed pretty logical and sensible in terms of the way the international accounting for emissions needs to work and the shared responsibilities where a transaction may happen between a country or an obligated party and another one, so that you don't get double counting. So without wanting to bring up technical terms, Article 6.2, as far as I understand it, and talk about it, is the transfer of emission obligations from a country, one country to another country, or a party to the Paris Agreement. So that if one country is using an emission reduction from another country, there needs to be an adjustment to that selling country so that you don't get double counting. Article 6.4 applies the same principle, except at the project level, where the source of the emission reduction is a project rather than a nation state. And if an entity creates that project, creates a project that reduces emissions, the use of those emissions for a party that has a reporting obligation under their nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, or an airline under the Corsia scheme, or any other scheme that can be created that has a reporting obligation under the Paris Agreement. If that entity is using those carbon credits, then there needs to be an adjustment to the host country, to the accounts of the host country. So that again, there is a net no double counting of those emission reductions, which seems very sensible when you have a comprehensive and integrated system of accounting that all rolls up to the global level. Why are we talking about it today? Well, the reason is that the Article 6 rulebook really is silent on what it means for the voluntary carbon market. It's entirely, its main purpose was to make sure that the reporting and accounting at the UN level for the Paris agreements and the nationally determined contributions is consistent, and we don't get any double counting. But the voluntary carbon market doesn't have that. Companies who may want to use carbon credits for their own communications purposes and their own strategies, climate strategies, don't have that reporting obligation under a country's accounting system for Paris. So there has been no need to make any adjustments at or the host governments have really not had a great role to play so far. So there's this argument that the company level accounting systems can be whatever they want to be. And if they want to lay claim to a credit, then that's fine. There are other arguments that there is a double claiming concern there. But from an Article 6 point of view, the rules haven't to date, and I don't think has any expectation they would wade into the voluntary sector. However, as I'll hand over to Lisa, who will give a more complex and comprehensive commentary on, there are implications now arising in terms of a process that host governments are now starting to have to consider in terms of how the future use of those credits. So that's my lay understanding, Lisa, and I can hand over to someone who knows a bit more about it than I do.
He's being very kind. He's handing over to the OCD in the crowd. So in terms of one of the adages that we drive through our team now, the effect of the decision, in my view, is that you can no longer call the voluntary market a purely voluntary market. There is overlap and potential convergence with the Paris compliance market. And the determination of whether or not that concurrence or convergence occurs is now in the hands of the host country. So the basis and impact of Article 6.2, to a lesser extent Article 6.4, is that the first question of diligence, the first element to consider is, what does the host country say about this? Are they authorizing this for use towards an NDC, a nationally determined contribution, or towards another international mitigation purpose? Are they saying nothing? Or are they expressly exempting this from authorization or not authorizing this? And that really defines where you are on that continuum. And I will now refer to it as a continuum between the purely voluntary market and the Paris compliance market. So that's a very high level way of, I think, really getting at how Article 6 has changed markets that we're very familiar with on the voluntary side, or may change, more accurately, voluntary markets. So these are important considerations as you're going forward.
All right, great. I'll come back with a few questions later on, but David, do you want to give us your sense of the implications of Article 6 for the voluntary sector?
Yeah, I think to me, the key consideration is, really thinking about what the underlying value is of the voluntary market credits, which really are about additional action beyond what's required by regulation. So the thing that we think about a lot and starting to think more is, presumably under the Paris Agreement, not just Article 6, countries will start to implement or increase the implementation of policies and regulations related to climate change. So that means that the scope for voluntary action will decrease over time. And that's a good thing, because we want to encourage governments to regulate their markets. And soon, there will be fewer and fewer opportunities for voluntary action because they will be required by regulation. The very first question we ask of a project is it required by regulation? And if it is, can't do a voluntary project. So there's that element of it, which is really critical to consider. It's starting to happen. And we see it already happening here in California, right? Landfills used to be a very popular, project activity, but they're no longer accepted by the government of California, because pretty much they say all landfills must be capped and all the landfill gas must be captured and destroyed. So I think there's that element for us is really critical. I would, present a slightly provocative alternative viewpoint to what Lisa said, which is, I think the markets are very different and the drivers are very different. I see the compliance market as being, basically following regulations, and the voluntary market being driven by voluntary, aspirations. And so in some ways they're very different. I think they will use the same infrastructure. For example, Article 6.2 is a great example. Two countries may agree that they can trade these units and they can use, as long as they agree on the infrastructure, and many of them will likely use existing infrastructure like the VCS program or the Climate Action Reserve. And then based on that, they can make those trades. So they'll use a very much similar infrastructure, but I think the fundamentals are somewhat different. So I think that at some point, convergence is a tricky word to think about this, because I think they will be fundamentally different markets. And in the end of the day, eventually, voluntary markets, I think we are in a process of seeing them grow tremendously. There's huge opportunity, particularly as we are on the path to net zero. There's huge opportunities to reduce the residual emissions as companies go from, being at 100% of their emissions when they're getting down to 10 or 5%, which we seek to achieve in 2050. And in the meantime, if we can drive the finance to addressing those residual emissions, I think that's where the sweet spot is.
Right, and I think the NDCs for a lot of countries are going to be a struggle. The idea is that they're stretching. So if you're sitting in the seat of a government who's looking at how do I achieve this NDC target, as I said, many countries off track. What sources of capital can I use? And the voluntary carbon market has provided, and is increasingly providing that source of capital. But do they need to take into account other factors? And Lisa, you mentioned this word authorization, host country authorization. Could you just give us a little bit more color on that continuum? Mm-hmm. And is this authorization a mandatory process that project developers will need to get clarity on, or can they just carry on and hope things are going to work out?
That wouldn't be the strategy I would recommend, going blindly into carry on and just hope things work out, particularly if you're deploying capital. And as I say that, you need to hear my bias as an assurance provider and a fiduciary who provides legal advice addressed at risk. So there are many who would take that approach, who are more commercially adventurous. From your lawyer's perspective in the background, they will warn you of the risks of doing so. And one of the risks of doing so is that whole concept of authorization. So the Article 6.2 decision in particular breaks down two elements of authorization, and it allows the host country where the project is situated to authorize for use the credits or types of projects, the credits resulting from types of projects, for two main purposes, two buckets of purposes. The first one is towards an NDC, towards presumably, although it's not clear in the language, another country's NDC, and this is one of those little niggle points that we want some clarity on in the next round of negotiations. And the second bucket is towards another international mitigation purpose. And because we're all in the climate markets, we can't speak in words, we speak in acronyms. We call those two buckets authorized for use, AFU towards an NDC, AFU/NDC, authorized for use, AFU towards another international mitigation purpose, AFU/OIMP. So those are the two buckets. And one of the risks is you start a voluntary project in Timbuktu country X. And you start it without any authorizations. You start it full steam ahead without thinking about anything, and don't ask for any government authorizations or ask for any exemptions from other government authorizations. And in year 2 of that 10-year project where you forward contracted for the emission reductions, the government says, right, I like those types of projects. I'm actually going to now authorize them for use towards an NDC. And effectively, a portion of your project is nationalized or expropriated as a function of that host country decision. So we like to encourage counterparties to get as much upfront certainty as they can on the authorization for use status.
But we're seeing this in a number of countries now, where the governments are looking at the revenue that the project developers, the landowners, are bringing in from the voluntary market and saying, yeah, I'd like to take a piece of that. That's a state asset, that's a forest or something like that. That's fine. They can put in some kind of export tax or carbon tax. Indonesia's been quite active in that space. But that doesn't necessarily mean, does that necessarily mean the project needs to be authorized under the UN, under sort of some kind of UN-backed registry system? Can they not just say, we've introduced a rule that says any export of carbon credits created under some accredited system, we'll take a tax on that? Does it need to be authorized as such, or can they just implement it on a sort of commercial basis?
There's all forms of government action that can occur in relation to both the project themselves and the credits that results from the project. They can indicate very clearly, this is exempt from authorization. We're passing a regulation. This isn't within the context of Paris. This has nothing to do with this. Go ahead with your voluntary deal. We're just going to take some tax in the form of credits associated with that. They can also say, you know, this really relates to our national inventory. And my national inventory is absolutely critical in showing under the Paris Agreement whether or not I've complied with my nationally determined contribution. And to the extent that these credits are going outside of my jurisdiction, and I have to report on them in my national inventory report, I've got a problem.
They've only got a problem if they are being used against another NDC or international mitigation.
It depends on what's in that initial national inventory report and what's in the nationally determined contribution. So diligence goes, what is the NIR? What does the inventory of the country look like? What is in the NDC? What's not in the NDC? And how does the authorization play out? What are they saying? And what certainty do I have now and going forward, particularly over the course of that compliance period under the Paris Agreement?
May I play back something you said in the previous session, Lisa, which is the name of the game is going to be the claims
That's
going
it.
forward, right? So I think that it's really important to consider that the COP at Glasgow does not require these corresponding adjustments, and it gives the authority to the countries to authorize whether they choose to or not. But what's really important, going back to the claim, and I think there's some work being done around this, particularly under the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which is to lend some credibility and consistency on the kinds of claims companies can make when they use carbon credits. And the claim that you could make today on the back of a voluntary credit as we know it today would be that you can claim you've made the emission reduction happen. It helps you offset your emission, but for the purposes of accounting under the Paris Agreement, it accrues to the host country. So I'm not so sure that there is such a risk of an expropriation, because the benefits from an emission reduction perspective are accruing to the host countries. And as long as we're clear about that, I think that's what's really important. And I think that's where the rule book landed in terms of what's required or not. Now, there's a different question, I see you gritting your teeth, but I think there's a different question whether you would want to get that authorization, because there may come a time when your buyers are going to say, well, what does the government say about this? And if you can just say, well, the government says nothing, and we've claimed that it's going to help their NDC, that might be fine, but it might be useful for folks who can say, well, actually, the government has approved this project, they've authorized it, or they've basically allowed it to go through, and it's in their registry and they know about it. And that's an important piece, because the voluntary market has to date operated, not being kind of directly working with governments, right? So we don't require government approval, and there's some very explicit reasons why we've gone down that path. But I think going forward in the world of the Paris Agreement, we're all going to have to be working on the same, on the same set of understanding of what's happening, particularly in a jurisdiction or a country, because I think that's going to lend credibility to the process.
I think there's a great point there around, we all have to get on the same page, but here's where words really matter in the context of the text. And we argued very hard for the term towards another NDC to be used. It's not what the text says. It says towards a NDC, which presumably can include its own NDC. We'd like to see some clarity at the intersessionals and going forward that they really meant towards another NDC, but sitting at the table on Article 6 drafting, we didn't get that despite arguing for it. So this needs to be clarified.
I think there's a lot of sense in a NDC rather than another NDC. I don't think there should be any distinction between the NDC of the host country and another. When you come back to your point about if it's being claimed, then
So you want a corresponding adjust on both if it's used internally?
yeah,
Okay.
but it doesn't need to. So that situation doesn't exist because I don't think that situation arises because it's anyway. Can I just go back to your point about the authorization? And if it's possible for a host government to put in place a tax or whatever it is, so they get share of the proceeds for the credit, make the creation of credits from a state asset, they can do that without having to put it in a UN registry, and the private entity that does the project can get the money from selling the carbon credits into the voluntary market. And under that situation, because it's not under Article 62 or 64, they don't have to make a corresponding adjustment to their own accounts, their own emissions inventory. Under what scenario would it be sensible for a host government to put it in an authorization, to give it the authorization to be included under 6.4, when they will have to make an adjustment to their emissions inventory with a corresponding adjustment? I'm struggling to see why a host government would want to do that, because every time they sell a credit outside, they're going to have to move their emissions up, so they're no nearer. This export of that credit puts them further away from achieving their NDC.
In the context of where we're at in the decision, there are a host of reasons why governments make policy. And one of them might be to affect compliance with their Paris targets. One of them might be, this is in my NDC, so I have got to report on it. And the registry per se comes in the form of the biennial transparency report that occurs every 2 years, but also the most important one is 2 years after the end of the compliance period. And that's how you affect determination of what credits were properly correspondingly adjusted, whether or not you have credits because you met your target, or you might have nothing because you didn't meet your target, and whether the accounting works. So that's where we're at in terms of any number of Paris compliance issues. And the key is some countries might want to do things through a regulated or Paris documented system. Others might want to do things through voluntary system, and yet others might want a combination of the approaches. And you need to look to what's in the context of that initial NDC, what's in the context of the initial national inventory report, and what the country has been saying about where it's going through its NDC.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the behavior, certainly from my experience, I've seen the behavior of host governments, particularly in the developing world, change quite significantly in the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they're making decisions. They're not saying yes, no, they're just keeping their options open. So a lot of countries are now setting up registries. So your point about even instead of a step before authorization, they just want to know what's going on. So previously, the host governments had no visibility on what was going on. And yes, you publish all of the projects in your registry and all the pipeline projects. So that's great. You can go and find them. But the host governments didn't do that job and didn't really sort of say, oh, we've got 20 projects in our country. Wow, I didn't know about that. So the first thing is just awareness. And then setting up a registry is just a formalization of that process. So I think they're just keeping their options open. So my comment to the room and the development communities, or the question to the panel is, should developers be concerned? Should they halt activities? Is there a hiatus looming where project development activity financing risks, a hiatus period while we get this sorted? What would your response to that be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, going back to, thinking about kind of the title of the session, right? I think I would start with what's happening with Article 6. And, in the previous session, there's a great conversation about the price of carbon today. It's pretty high. And if you look at Europe, it's 75 euros. I mean, that's a lot. And, Kelly, who was moderating, had the point like, it used to be that the Europeans thought, well, we're all going to do this internally and we're all going to be fine. 75 euros, that starts to become a different calculus and ultimately bring back to really the core of what carbon offsets are all about, right? Providing some sort of, price flexibility for addressing a compliance obligation. So I think you're going to start to see if prices remain this high, governments start to figure out how to implement Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 transactions, which means they're going to have to start to figure out how they're going to treat these units. So going back to the corresponding adjustments, if I'm a government and I'm going to allow some credits to flow from my country outside, it means I'm going to have to find the same number of credits in my economy. And if I'm allowing credits that are kind of low-hanging fruit, I've got to make sure that I've got resources to cover that shortfall. So I'm going to tax them. I'm going to require minimum pricing like China did under the CDM. I may have volume restrictions. There's going to have to be some thinking and processing for how governments treat these so that they have the confidence that they can actually allow these to flow through these mechanisms, but not be left holding the bag. So I think we're going to start to see that. And I think as you start to see that play out, governments are going to start to say, well, what does this mean for the voluntary market, right? It could be the government say, it's fine as long as the claims are clear and I'm getting the benefit for the reductions, have at it, go fine. But it could be that governments are saying, well, actually, no, we want to have some control. We want to give at least the authorization or the blessing for these projects to go forward. And it may be the buyers will be requiring that as well, because there could be some uncertainty around that. So it is not required, but if I were a developer, I'd be thinking about that and following the policy dialogues that are happening in the country so you understand what's going on, either in the context of the Article 6 transactions, but also in the context of how this might play out in the voluntary market.
When we were chatting before the session briefly, I've kind of analogized it to a country discovering a mineral find, a natural, I've just discovered I'm sitting on top of X amount of lithium in my natural resources within the context of my country. Every country, as a function of the November 13th, 2021 decision of the COP, has just discovered I have a new natural resource and it's called carbon.
But it's not a zero-sum game, right?
It's not a zero-sum.
That's the key thing. So lithium, if you can't use it internally, you'll export it and you'll drive some value and you'll have all sorts of controls over that. But with carbon, at least the way it works now, is that carbon in the voluntary market can be used by a company to meet its internal voluntary purposes, but the reductions can stay in country. And as long as the claims are clear, that's where the rule book stands. But there are those other risks relating to, do you need government to bless it?
Right, and I'm going to answer my own question, which I posed, because I'm not a lawyer and I don't have to take that incredibly. So in business, I think most people in the room, if they're on the development side, are going to be asking this question every day. Either they're looking to secure credits from a country, they're looking to invest in the country and do a project. And the question they need to answering is, should I proceed if I haven't got a letter of authorization from the host country that clarifies some of these issues or not? And I think if I was a trained lawyer, I'd probably say, no, hold off. You need to make sure that before you put that money to work, you have that clarity from the host government. But we know that governments aren't going to, turn that decision around in a week. Could take months, years before they understand what their position on this is. So if it's going, I don't know please put a hand up, or anybody's got an example of a government you can go to today to get clarity on that authorization. I don't know if anyone's got a process in place that's going to say, yep, just fine, you're authorized or not authorized for whatever purpose. That could take a while. Meanwhile, the necessity to invest and produce credits for voluntary use is going to continue. So, I come back to my original question. My own sort of understanding is that I think the risk of ex post expropriation is low by a host government. So therefore the process should continue, but with eyes open to the potential requirements that a host government may make in terms of, yeah, you need to tick these boxes, you need to get these authorizations. That would be my recommendation. What would I know as a lawyer, you would probably countenance a little more risk.
That risk. I am not in a position to get in the mind of the government. For example, I would not have anticipated that Indonesia would have put effectively a suspension on credits going out of its jurisdiction for a period of time. I did not foresee that. What I would say is, you as the business decision makers need to assess how you factor that risk into the commercial deal you're making. Will you pay more for a transaction that has an exemption for authorization? Will you pay more for tons that are authorized for use towards an NDC or towards another international mitigation purpose? What political risk factors are you bringing to bear in doing your due diligence? And this is where I get to take the Weasley lawyer way out. We don't make those decisions. We actually advise on the risks and the benefits and how you might want to factor these into your commercial thinking when you make the ultimate final commercial decision on how to proceed.
Okay.
So there's one element here, which I think is really important to bring into focus. And that is that the vast majority of these projects are providing tangible, sustainable benefits to the host countries. So I would tend to agree that the risk is low. I wouldn't say it doesn't exist, because the governments like Indonesia might say, no more credits starting in the state until we figure this out. So there's a risk there. Well, I won't opine on how big it is, but I think as what we've seen is that many of these projects operating, particularly in the developing world, they're bringing critical resources to bear on communities who've not had the resources from the central government. So they're providing education, health benefits, jobs. And this is a life-changing opportunity for communities and folks who are working with these projects. So to the extent that that can be highlighted, that's a clear benefit for the government, right? If they're all of a sudden getting resources to provide support for communities who've traditionally not had support from the central government, that's huge. And I think that is part of the discussions that need to be had and brought to bear, so that the government, doesn't make a rash decision to just, stop things, because it is really helping them in many ways.
Right. Great, thank you. I think it's probably time to bring in the audience.
Now that we've thoroughly confused you.
Yeah. Right. Throw it open. Does anybody have any questions for this esteemed panel? Yeah, gentleman there.
Do wave your hand. The lights are quite bright and we're having trouble
There's
seeing.
another one over there. Yeah. Okay, Brad after this gentleman.
Hi, Alvin Mehra from California Carbon. Brilliant dissection of the issue. And I guess I'm still stuck a little bit with a little bit of the fundamental, if you don't mind clarifying. Where does the accounting lie for the offset that's generated? Does it lie in the host country, or does it lie where it gets used? And the reason I ask that is it sort of became clear that it lies in the host country. But when we're looking at the voluntary market sort of rising in volume, and we see it going from, let's say, 1 billion tons to a couple of billion tons to a few billion tons, I'm curious how does that begin, what shape that begins to take, and I'd be curious if you can sort of color that.
Shall I start?
Sure.
It's a great question. And the question starts with looking at what's in the national inventory, what's outside the national inventory, how you are actually creating the what is being transferred, and how it's being used. So back to the name of the game is the claim, very important, but also what's in and out of the NIR, what's in and out of the NDC, and how is it being used? And in particular, that accounting is extremely relevant, and I'm going deep into corresponding adjustments here, depending on certain types of authorization. So we talked about the two acronyms, AFU, NDC. The timing of that accounting is upon first transfer. So whenever it goes from one country to the next, both countries are making that associated plus or minus. If it's AFU OIMP towards another international mitigation purpose, the host country has the discretion of determining when that accounting is done, either on authorization, issuance, or use. And it could be, if they choose use, you're waiting a period of 5 years throughout a compliance period to have that accounting done. And if I'm walking on one side of that equation, I think that's a bit of a contingent liability. I have to wait 10 or 5 years for that to occur, 5 years during the compliance period.
But just for clarity, those two use cases, AFU and AFU OIMP, our compliance uses under the UN accounting system for the Paris Agreement. The voluntary carbon market doesn't require that.
Yes and no. If the voluntary is in the national inventory report, you've got an annual report that you have to make. And if it's in the national inventory report, you've got a biennial transparency report. So every 2 years, you have to adjust for that. If it's out, which is possible, in a number of NDCs, there are activities well outside the national inventory, and that's different.
Yeah, just for clarity, when we talk about NDCs, the simple view is that, well, an NDC is the emission reduction target for a country, and therefore a country has to add up all its emissions, and they come from fossil fuel use, industrial processes, and land use. So everything's included. In reality, particularly in the developing world, that's not the case. That some countries have only set targets for, say, power sector emissions and transportation or industry, and they've actually left parts of the total greenhouse gas emissions outside their NDC. So it is a very sort of interesting patchwork of NDCs that we have. The idea is that all of those, over time, those NDCs grow to cover more and more of the emissions. The big countries, though, do. The big countries in are pretty comprehensive NDCs with land use change.
Take Canada, for example. We have accounted for our sinks in one way, and then we changed how we accounted for our sinks. And I was in the room while our biennial transparency report was being raked over the coals for that change, and did make it through. We don't account for methane emissions from permafrost destruction. That's not in our initial national inventory. It's not in our NDCs. That might be an area of interest.
Yeah, no, there are some interesting anomalies. Brad, I think you were over there next.
Thanks very much. Brad Schaller with WWF. And so I had a question. I actually have a couple questions, but I'm gonna ask one, and I'll this is the main one that I'm interested in you answering. So Lisa, you talked about AFU in DC. You talked about authorized for use for other international mitigation purposes, but even other international mitigation purposes breaks down into two different subcategories. So one is, I guess it would be international mitigation purposes, which is CORSIA, right? And then there's other purposes, which is sort of this, often interpreted as voluntary market use towards within domestic cap and trade systems, right? So there's actually a further breakdown within that. So how do you think about the differentiation in the process for other purposes, right? For the voluntary market, because that seems like you're not actually authorizing toward a corresponding adjustment in that case. It's more authorizing for the project to exist in some ways. That's That's just sort of the thought exercise that I go through on that. So, but I'm curious reactions. that
Yeah,
you have.
let me first start with international mitigation purposes. Many in the market have assumed that's CORSIA or IMO, which are outside of the UNFCCC. Nowhere in the decisions does it say that. So, number one. Number two, international mitigation purposes and other purposes are lumped into the same category for corresponding adjustments. The effect of that is it's whatever the host country says it is usable for. So read host country discretion. And in terms of the accounting, it's a distinction without a difference because both are subject to corresponding adjustments at the time, again, that the host country says it is. So the host country can say what it's authorized for, and it's got complete discretion in what it can and cannot authorize things for. And it can, if it does so, say when that accounting has to take place: issuance, authorization, or use. Those are its three options.
I take a slightly, I'll answer the question in the sense that, if you think about what the Article 6 or the Paris Agreement regulates, it's emissions from countries, right? And then there's other international mitigation purposes like IMO or CORSIA that sit outside of the reporting framework of the Paris Agreement, and yet are still international compliance obligations.
No, just for those in the room, IMO is
IMO
International
is the International Maritime Organization, so shipping. And I think, and this is unfortunate because there's still lack of clarity, but I think there's there's one interpretation of that is that any voluntary action isn't a regulated action. It is a voluntary action that's going above and beyond what might be required by governments. So to mix the voluntary action into this compliance framework, I think is potentially a mistake. And I think that it's risky because it ends up creating a whole lot of uncertainty, because now you're saying, well, there's going to be these requirements under the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is explicitly about reporting at the national level for targets set out to meet the 1.5 degrees target that we have for 2050. So yeah, I actually, and we thought that this had been settled because Glasgow did explicitly not say that voluntary action requires corresponding adjustments. But unfortunately, there's still a little lack of clarity in the language that hopefully gets cleared up.
It really goes back to that authorization, that host country authorization. And that's where I make the point that there's convergence between what you and I would think of traditionally as voluntary and what now might be an authorized activity that's a Paris activity.
Any other questions? Yeah, one at the back there, then that one, and then that one, then yourself.
So Robert Parkhurst with Sierra View Solutions. I've got an easy question and a hard question. So the easy question is, so you talk about next steps. How about the when? When are we going to see this? When are we going to see, is it going to go through COP27? Is it going to go, will the countries start creating their own things? Will the CDM executive board go away and be replaced? So that's the easy question. The hard question is, Lisa, you were talking about national inventories if something was counted. So let's take a simple example. So the US NDC and its national inventory look at emissions from livestock, manure specifically. The Climate Action Reserve has a protocol for livestock management. So let's say you've got a livestock digester in New York, generates credits, voluntary, through the reserve, and sells them to Canada, to a company in Canada. Do you have to adjust the national baseline for that? Can the US count that? And can Tim Hortons in Canada count that?
Great question.
Another example is the use of an offset within the California scheme as well. There's no change to the national emissions inventory for any credits that have been used for compliance in California. So a more pertinent one. I mean, I'll put that question back to my two panelists, but I'll just run through the other questions and then we'll do them all at the same time. So, yeah.
This Rob Alloway with Reformation Carbon. My question was on the kind of the threat of government intervention and, you know, expropriation or nationalization, as you mentioned it. And I'm actually kind of surprised that there haven't been more comments at the conference about the move by Indonesia. But at some point, you know, the difference between copper and carbon credits, lithium, as you used the example, is somebody has to take the product and ship it out of the country. And Indonesia, you know, has a record for threatening to stop copper exports. But at some point, the credit is an accounting entry with an NGO sitting in either Geneva or Washington, DC. So unlike copper, where men in green outfits can come and basically shut down the mine or shut down the port, nobody's going to go and chop down the trees in a highly additional project that I funded. So can you just speak to actually how expropriation works really, and this threat of becoming authorized and therefore not usable? If I funded a highly additional project and then I want to retire those credits in the registry and I claim the tons, you know, what stops me?
You're right. We'll take all the 4 questions and then we'll just wrap.
I don't have them written down, so I'm hopeful.
I'm
that you're-
writing them
yeah,
down. Got a pen.
Hi there, my name's Denver. This question is for Lisa. So in the last session, and you alluded to it during this session as well, you mentioned that the ITMOs don't exist if the host country is not in compliance with their NDCs. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure.
Okay, and then the final, the other 4 questions, the other 4th question was that.
Hello, this is Pedro Morales. I mean, from the legal point, as a lawyer, I just have one thing in mind. This could be seen as an expropriatory measure from the point of view of most trade agreements, of trade and investment agreements. If you come up with a national authority requesting authorization, you would lose your right under the protection of an investment agreement in that regard, not only for the project you want to implement, but for others you may have in that country as well. So requesting authorization just like that with a national authority would be meaning like losing your rights, your carbon rights. So that's what I have a little bit in mind about being doubtful to go just with an authority if there's not a national law expressly establishing this, and just going out and requesting an authorization, because then it could leave a really bad legal precedent. Thank you.
Okay. If I can collapse that up with Rob's question, which was about the expropriation process and how that would happen, then I can put 2 to 1. A lot of those questions are related to the legal sort of machinery, but let me put David on the spot first. Robert, when are we likely to get clarity on some of these issues?
That's a crystal ball. I don't know. You're starting to see it play out. So Indonesia is a good example, but governments have to put in place their regulations. But an example where that project in New York gets sold to Canada, the rules are pretty clear. If that happens for a compliance obligation and Canada is going to use that ton to meet its targets under the Paris Agreement, then there has to be a corresponding adjustment, and the US would have to have a system to account for that. And then Canada would also have to have a system to embed that reduction into its reporting under the Paris Agreement. If it's a voluntary project, again, to kind of re-emphasize the point, there is no requirement that a corresponding adjustment is needed. Now, the buyer in Canada may want to get assurances that the US government or the government of New York or whatever, has blessed the project or, in some way, shape or fashion, but it's not required. But when this is going to happen, we see governments starting to put together the infrastructure, but it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's not going to happen in 2030 either. So sorry to say this is as long as a piece of string, but I think you'll start to see some governments come up with some solutions, and other folks will look at those and see if they work. Maybe they adapt them. So, probably in the next several years, you'll start to see some examples of governments putting in the infrastructure to make this happen.
Just to follow up on the Article 6.2, 6.4 machinery, We have the SUBSTA being required to make recommendations on a number of these items for adoption at COP27, which is November 2nd to 18th in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. Do I have that right? I think those are the dates, 2nd to 18th. Don't hold me to it. In and around that time period. And there are a couple of elements, special circumstances for least developed countries. So you could see a development of further relaxed rules for least developed countries, further guidance on the accounting, specifically corresponding adjustments, consideration of whether ITMOs can include emissions avoidance, and then the UN Secretariat. So that's the SUBSTA. The UN Secretariat is involved in reporting and accounting and transparency. They've got some recommendations to make. They had a workshop. Comments were due March 31st. They have a workshop in May, and the intersessional is middle of June, where a number of these decisions will be taken. And then on Article 6.4, the supervisory body, that's the top-down structure that makes Article 6.4 different. It's the analog to what used to be the CDM executive board is going to make rules and procedures for the body itself. And it's got share of the proceeds decisions to make. What are they? What's the expense, the fee that needs to be paid? And then activities involving removals. And finally, the application of mechanisms and methodology. So that's all coming forward, and that's coming forward in parallel to developments outside of the UNFCCC, specifically in CORSIA and in the International Maritime Organization. And then the other questions, Canada, US, you'll note that there was a bilateral session between our governments under the guise of energy. I don't think it's unlikely that these issues will, I think it's likely that these issues will be very much on the table in terms of our two jurisdictions' coordination and cooperation. In particular, we do have a mini border carbon adjustment in the form of energy through the first jurisdictional deliverer obligation going between the import and export of power between Quebec and the Northeast. Right now, there is a carbon accounting differential that has to go on there in terms of the purchase and sale of offsets between the regulated systems. Of course, we have a linked market. If it goes in through Quebec, that accounting is already addressed. If it goes into another entity or other province in the country, how do we deal with those? There's a joint accounting rule under the WCI that was considering a number of these features, and we expect progress there. The other question was in relation to the treaty. Sorry.
I think there were two questions in relation to the process of expropriation.
In terms of?
How would that work in practice?
Basically, it's a stroke of the pen risk where is it expropriation and sterilization? And that was one of the assumptions. I don't know that it's expropriation and sterilization, but certainly a country would say, we authorize this for use, as Indonesia has done. And by the way, 30% remain with us as the government. 30% of your credits remain with us. So that's sort of what we're seeing happening and being contemplated in other jurisdictions. Is that a traditional expropriation per se, or is it something like a tax or a pay-to-play? Many different rules. The question was asked about it doesn't exist if you're not in compliance. That's a rule under Article 6.2. So it's very important to ensure that you're on track to meet your NDC according to the 6.2 requirements. And then in terms of the import tax and questions relating to how do all these things come to play? Are there potential broader trade agreements and investment treaties that come to play? Absolutely. There's an active NAFTA claim in Ontario right now where Coke Industries is bringing a claim under the investment chapter historically of NAFTA, which was then in force, for provincial effective expropriation of credits it had purchased.
I'm going to come back to you, Robert, in 1 second, but can I just look, a question that's just arisen in my head, David, if we're talking about host government authorizations and host government registries, because they need to know where those projects are, the claim is just a claim, it's just words. and ideal in the way in which the voluntary carbon market work, those claims should be directly and are currently directly associated with the retirement of credits in a registry. If governments are creating their own registries, David, how does that work with your system? Because you have the registry of all the projects, 60% of the market. Is there a work going on to make sure that the host government registries are the same and
Yes.
they're connected?
Yes, there's a lot of work with host country governments, making sure that our registries are connected and that they have full view of what's happening. Now, it all depends on, our registry is up and running and we can link to them, but they're in the process. Many countries are developing those registries. So they'll have full direct access to the extent that, once they built those registries, and that would be good.
Great.
And this is a really important function of what Verra and other standards and registries are doing. Right now, your rules are you can't exist in more than one registry at the same time, right? And so how you affect a comprehensive picture that accommodates the Article 6.2 machinery is really important work that you're doing, extremely important.
Yeah, sorry, Robbie, you want to come back?
Indonesia just decided who owns 30% of the credits of the project. They can report to you actually. So if they don't jump 30% to the government, then 100% of the credits of the project still go to some. So perhaps on this point, when we talk about expropriation or authorization, stroke, it's not like a traditional commodity because the government of Indonesia does not touch any of the voluntary carbon market at the moment. Verra gets reports of validation, they decide what the issues, valid issues by
That's the assumption at the moment.
Yeah.
And they do have authority and discretion. And in certain instances, indigenous people can make a claim for authority and agency over that treatment of the carbon rights, particularly as it gets exported out of the country. So that's a key element. You have to look at the jurisdiction of the national government and the authorization and authority they have over carbon.
So I think, just to play, Robert, just to pick up on, if I sort of expand that, if the project reduces 100 tons and the government says, now hold on a minute, we want to take 30 of that and you can only use 70, but the buyer or the financer, the investor says, no, don't care, I'm going to claim 100. I'm a corporate in Europe or America, I'm going to claim 100. What stops them saying that?
Registry, because,
Yes.
if there's a national regulation that says, this is how it has to go, we then have to abide by national law to make sure that the issuances go to the right account.
And this is where you play an incredibly important gatekeeping and integrity function. And let's not lose sight of the fact that we need environmental integrity in ensuring that this market continues. So you play an incredibly important role in facilitating that integrity.
No, I totally agree. Totally agree. We've got time for one more question. Otherwise, you can get to lunch 60 seconds earlier. No, lunch is beckoning. Okay, fantastic. David, Lisa, thanks so much. I learned a lot. I hope it was educational for everybody. There is more work to be done. I think there's more clarity that the speed needs to be progressed. My final, the $6 million question that sort of sits in my mind, if I put myself in the shoes of a developer, is, should I stop doing what I'm doing and wait for all of this to be clarified, or progress cautiously and eyes open? And my recommendation would be the latter. I think there's a sort of certain prevailing logic underpinning this, that countries need capital. Voluntary market provides that capital. We need to make sure there's no double counting at all at the compliance level. But that's the underlying logic, that corporate capital in developed world often can be put to good use. And that we need to sort it out. We need to make sure that there aren't those overhanging risks that the lawyers, when you're doing the signing off on the term sheets, and they're going to say, oh, yeah, but we can't sign off on that. You know, there's a warranty or there's a disclosure requirement, or whatever it is. That needs to be sorted. But you know, there's a certain overarching logic, which I think my sense will prevail.
I would add one more thought here, is that all of this discussion has been based on credits moving from one place to the other. But, you know, one of my initial comments was thinking about what governments are doing to tackle climate change on their own. And I think that's going to be something that we're going to start to see. And that will mean the creation of localized or domestic carbon markets. So in many ways, it's a great opportunity for project developers, because if you can slot into a national program, then you don't have to deal with all this stuff about, you know, where do the credits go? And if they're actually, you know, invested in and used by domestic buyers, then that's ultimately, you know, one of the great solutions. And we see this in Colombia, right? Where Colombia, now South Africa, they have local carbon taxes, and people are investing lots of money. And now the project developers are in a great position because they have a floor price from the carbon tax, but they can actually sell abroad if they want, to the voluntary market. So I think one unwritten or one likely outcome of all of these discussions is that governments will start to develop their national regulations on climate, which will, you know, obviously affect the scope for voluntary action, but will also start to create further markets for projects in a domestic context, which I think is really important.
That's actually a hugely important point. I'm just going to clock, but that is actually a hugely important point, which I omitted to comment on earlier, which is part of the reasons for the registries at the host government level is not for managing international trade and facilitation. It's so that they can manage their own compliance schemes. So you mentioned Colombia. Indonesia has a carbon tax on its power sector. It's a tax and trade. They're putting, a lot of the developing countries putting in place tax and trade systems. So rather than having a cap on their power sector, they've got a tax, and you offset the tax with a credit from the forestry sector. Vietnam is looking at that. Brazil is looking at that. So a lot of these big countries are now starting to say, hold on, we need market-based instruments to reduce our consumption of fossil fuel, and we can use the domestic carbon trade. So the Colombia example, the Indonesia example, is the reason why they might put those restrictions on exports is not necessarily for any other reason other than they're building their own domestic cap and trade or tax and trade systems, and they want to give preference to that first, rather than overseas buyers. So that's an important sort of qualification.
Just in the event that we've put the fear of something in you, I want to reaffirm that we're all aligned on the conclusion that it's not stop the carbon market. It's that 99% of the challenge is awareness, and continuing to be aware of what's going on, what the rules are, what the decisions say, and how it's evolving at pace is going to be incredibly important. And there are solutions. There are many solutions to mitigate risk.
Fantastic. We're a little over. Thanks very much.